Well, welcome back to Things You Don't Know. Today, we're looking at a gesture almost everyone recognizes. Somebody is waiting for test results, hoping for good weather, or wondering whether they'll get a new job. And they say they got their fingers crossed. But cross those same fingers behind your back while making a promise, and suddenly the gesture means something completely different. So, where did this come from? And why have two crossed fingers become connected with luck? What do you think, Chandler?
Well, Dr. Weaver, I think that right from the beginning, we should probably spoil one part of the story here.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah, just one part here. Nobody can point to one specific particular person or date and say, oh, that's when finger crossing began.
Okay, I thought you were going to say something bad, but yeah, I agree with you on that one, Chandler, for sure.
Yeah.
You know, Dr. Weaver and Chandler, that's actually fairly typical of folk customs. People want ancient traditions to have neat origin stories. This began on August 14th, 404 BCE at 2 in the morning, but it doesn't work like that. Customs change very gradually, and the explanations people give centuries later isn't necessarily the explanation that started the custom.
Yeah, you're right. And there are several theories about crossed fingers. Some are plausible, some are repeated so often that they've become accepted as fact, even though the historical evidence is, to say the best, very thin.
Perhaps the best known explanation connects crossed fingers with Christianity. Two fingers placed across one another resemble a small Christian cross, and the cross has obviously been associated with divine protection for centuries. So, crossing your fingers may have developed as a symbolic appeal for protection, assistance, and a favorable outcome.
I wonder about that because when I cross my fingers, they look like snakes intertwined, not crosses.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a tradition in the Catholic, Orthodox, and Episcopal churches. There's something called the sign of the cross.
Yeah,
We do it, for example, when a Mass begins. And
right.
Catholics use three fingers to symbolize the three persons of the Trinity. The Orthodox use two to symbolize the divine and human nature of Jesus Christ, just to be a theologian here for a minute.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, Dr. Dineen. But then we get the more dramatic version. Now, supposedly, the early Christians used crossed fingers as a secret sign to recognize one another while Christianity was being persecuted.
Yeah, and that's where I'd become skeptical. Christianity certainly gave the cross tremendous symbolic importance, but that doesn't prove the modern finger crossing gesture began as a secret identification signal.
I agree, Dr. Weaver, that we can't prove it, but I wouldn't dismiss Christian influence altogether. If people already regarded that cross as protective, making that symbol with the fingers isn't that much of a leap.
No, that's true. I just, the thought occurred to me that this might have something to do with Wiccan and some other religious things too. So the problem is the difference between saying Christianity probably influenced the gesture and claiming we established the precise origin, because guess what? We haven't.
No, we have not, Dr. Weaver. So the Christian connection is plausible. The secret Christian handshake story is much harder to document. Now, there's also a broader theory that goes beyond Christianity. Cross lines and intersections had symbolic meanings in many older cultures.
You're right.
Crossroads especially attracted beliefs about fate, boundaries, danger, spirits, and supernatural forces.
Yeah, that's why I thought about Wiccan, Chandler.
Yeah, it does put you in mind of that.
Anybody interested in that should check out our Wiccan podcast with my good friend Lisa Eisenhower. You learn a lot from that. But that's important because Christianity did not invent the idea that intersections could be significant. Human beings have long treated the boundary points as unusual places, the meeting of two roads, land and water, or darkness and daylight.
But I'd be cautious again. That's useful cultural background, but we shouldn't turn it into another definite origin story. We can say that crossed shapes and intersections had symbolic importance long before the modern gesture. We can't necessarily draw a straight historical line from an ancient crossroads ritual to somebody crossing their fingers before a job interview, for example.
Fair enough. Sometimes we historians, I'll confess it on behalf of the profession, have a tendency to see two similar things separated by 1,000 years and immediately connect them. As you often say, Dr. Weaver, connection is not causality.
And sometimes people on the internet do that even faster.
Oh, you got that one right, Chandler. Regardless of exactly where it began, finger crossing fits into a much larger human habit. Doing something when the outcome is beyond our control, in other words. People have carried charms, said prayers, avoided supposedly unlucky actions, knocked on wood, for example, worn lucky clothing, and performed countless small rituals before uncertain events.
And crossing your fingers may work psychologically even if you don't believe it changes anything physically. If you're waiting to hear whether you got the job, you can't control the decision anymore. Crossing your fingers gives you something to do while you wait. That's all it does.
As I say to the young people in my theater class, Chandler, you're right, you're right, you're absolutely right. Oh, thank you very much. But I'm not sure I'd even call it superstition every time we do it today. If I tell somebody, keeping fingers crossed for your surgery tomorrow, I'm not necessarily claiming that my fingers possess any kind of medical powers.
Well, yeah, that's true. Today, it's often just shorthand for, I hope this goes well.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't even physically cross your fingers. You just say the words. And you know, Dr. Weaver and Dr. Dineen, that's really one of the interesting things to me about a lot of these expressions, like we mentioned, knock on wood and crossing your fingers. Anymore, we don't even do the actions, it just turns into saying the words.
You guys are correct about that. And that shows how far the expression has moved from whatever ritual originally produced it. The gesture became a phrase, and now the phrase survives perfectly well even without the gesture.
And then come children, and
Hmm.
they manage to complicate everything here. At some point, crossed fingers also became associated with escaping a promise. A child could say, "Oh, I promise I didn't break it," while hiding crossed fingers behind his back. And supposedly, the promise did not count.
Which raises a rather interesting question. How did a gesture meaning, I hope for good fortune, become a gesture meaning, I'm not bound by what I'm saying?
Well, Dr. Weaver, you're asking something very challenging. You're asking historians to explain the ancient and sacred traditions of playground law. That may be beyond our jurisdiction, I'm afraid.
It might be Dr. Deneen, but you know what? The distinction here is pretty clear. You cross your fingers openly, and you're hoping for luck. You hide them behind your back and cross them, and you're signaling that the promise isn't sincere.
And this second meaning probably survived because children love rules, but they love loopholes almost as much.
Some adults do too, they're called politicians. But
Oh,
I actually think there's something more interesting going on. The crossed fingers are still functioning as kind of a protective symbol, because you were supposedly protecting yourself from the consequences of the promise. If you admit you broke the window, maybe you lose dessert that night, so you won't say anything.
Or maybe you don't get to go outside and play the next day. And that is possible, Dr. Dineen. But I have to say, I doubt that most 8-year-olds have developed that theory yet. They only know that somebody told them that crossed fingers make the promise not count.
And that's precisely how traditions survive. You don't have to understand their origins, you just learn the rule from somebody else. That's one reason everyday customs are so interesting. We inherit behaviors long after their original explanations have become very unclear. We say, bless you, when somebody sneezes. We knock on wood. Some people avoid walking under ladders or worry about Friday the 13th. Most people couldn't give you a reliable history of those customs.
If you're interested in Friday the 13th, we got a heck of a podcast on that, folks. But sometimes the explanation we learn later isn't historical at all. Somebody invents a good story, it gets repeated, and eventually the story becomes attached to the custom.
That's exactly right. And finger crossing is a good example of this. We have Christian explanations. We have older theories about crossed symbols and intersections. And later, we have folk traditions. They're all part of the story, but we shouldn't pretend at all that the evidence lets us choose one confidently.
And there may never have been one origin anyway. Customs can develop from several influence and change meaning as they move through different generations.
You know, as with so many other things, folks, there's another issue worth mentioning. Modern people sometimes draw a sharp boundary between religious practice and superstition, but historically that boundary could be blurry. Someone might pray for a good harvest, invoke the Lord or their favorite saint if they're Catholic, and also observe a local custom believed to bring good fortune. Those practices could exist side by side.
Oh, and they still do, Dr. Deneen. You know, somebody can have strong religious beliefs and still also say, knock on wood or fingers crossed without seeing any contradiction in it.
Yeah, because many of these expressions no longer require literal belief. They're cultural habits. If I say, fingers crossed that my flight leaves on time, I'm probably expressing hope rather than announcing a theological position.
You're quite correct, Dr. Weaver, and that's why I'd argue the modern meaning matters at least as much as the ancient origin. Whatever finger crossing meant centuries ago, most people today understand it immediately as, hey, I'm pulling for you. I hope this happens.
Yeah. So, why exactly did this particular gesture survive when thousands of other old customs just faded away, just disappeared, Dr. Weaver?
Well, it's probably because it's easy, recognizable, and useful. You don't need an object. You don't need a ceremony. You can do it anywhere.
And because the situation it expresses hasn't changed, human beings still deal with outcomes. Try as they might, they can't control. Well, we can certainly predict the weather better than our ancestors could, but we still hope the storm misses the picnic. Medicine has advanced enormously, thank goodness, but patients still wait nervously for their test results.
That's right, Dr. Deneen, and we still wait for acceptance letters, job offers, election results, delayed flights, phone calls, and answers from people that we've asked out on dates.
And in those situations, fingers crossed says something very simple. I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope it goes my way. So, just to wrap things up here, so where did crossing our fingers come from? The most accurate answer is that we don't know exactly. Christian symbolism probably contributed to its development. Older beliefs about crossed shapes, intersections, protection, and good fortune may also have played a part. And over generations, the gesture evolved into the familiar expression of hope we use today.
Meanwhile, crossing your fingers behind your back took on its own meaning. The idea, as Chandler said, that you're somehow exempting yourself from keeping a promise.
Yep, but for the record, just remember crossed fingers do not actually cancel promises.
Chandler, I'd like to see your historical documentation for that.
Well, I'm going to side with Chandler on this one. And that's one of the interesting facts about these tiny customs. We perform them almost automatically, even though their history may reach back for centuries through religion, superstition, folklore, and changing social habits.
So the next time somebody tells you fingers crossed, you'll know what they're really saying.
They care about you, so they're hoping for the best.
And that's something people have been doing for a very long time. Listen, you've been listening to things you don't know, quick and quirky. Thanks for joining us, and we hope we'll see you again for another quick and quirky look at strange history beyond something quite ordinary.
Yeah, be sure to give us a like, comment with some things that you might want to see us cover, and be sure and subscribe. And we'll see you next time, folks.
Bye bye.